So good morning. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's a great privilege to be here. I should start by saying now for something completely different. I think if Karl-Heinz started at the kind of global view, I'm going to start from the other end, from a worm's eye perspective, with the focus particularly on people. Perhaps you would expect that from me, being an anthropologist. But specifically what I want to do in this talk is to highlight the problem of people who occupy land and use resources that powerful actors want to acquire. This could be for large farms, logging, mines, and also for conservation. So people who are on the spot, but whose labor isn't needed because the anticipated, more profitable, or more conservation-friendly land uses absorb few workers. So looking at the word tree that was presented earlier, what I noticed was that jobs, work, employment, people, livelihood were in fact not very present in that word tree that was presented to us. If they were there, they were really small, so I missed them. But that's the angle that I'm going to take up here. So I want to start with a big argument, which is that the global presence of a large and burgeoning population of the and underemployed throws into question a key narrative which everyone knows in terms of development or modernization, or more specifically, agrarian transition. And this is the narrative which insists that all of the people of the world will, sooner or later, experience a natural progression from country to city, from farm to factory, and from low to high productivity work, which will bring prosperity to all. This is a very familiar narrative, the modernization narrative, agrarian transition narrative. And I think it's a very problematic one, so that's the one I want to really challenge today. Shockingly, in my view, the core of this transition narrative continues to be repeated by the development industry today. In 2008, the World Development Report on Agriculture, produced by the World Bank, repeated the agrarian transition narrative unrevised, allocating nations of the world to positions along a linear pathway that headed resolutely away from the farm and towards the city or jobs or other sectors. What was shocking about it to me was that the report maintained the container of the nation state, as World Bank speak, like UN speak does, as if each and every nation could be expected to develop a manufacturing sector on cue, and the global circulation of capital played no role. But one could ask, what good or what use are manufacturing jobs in the center of global production, such as Germany or China, if you're pushed off the land in the backwoods of Indonesia when a plantation employing few workers grabs your land? So it's not that there's no jobs globally, it's that they do not exist in each and every country, and it seems to me very unlikely that they ever will. Further work by the World Bank on the so-called global land grab acknowledged that the jobs created by what it called more productive agriculture did not equal the jobs and livelihoods which were lost, but it did not proffer a solution. It simply made the assumption that all these surplus people would find somewhere else to go and something else to do. For those who ended up in cities, the bank started to pin its hopes on the informal sector, as if every displaced farmer and every school leaver could create their own job or enterprise. This, I would suggest, is the story of capitalist development as creative destruction. It's the suggestion in which the creative part, the brighter future that is to come, is a vague promise, but it's not a concrete plan. We live in an era in which huge and diverse sectors of the global population, both urban and rural, north and south, educated or not, struggle to find work or find any productive function and viable source of livelihood, and I see no prospect that this will turn around. Periods of high growth in India, in Indonesia, South Africa, for example, have been recognized as virtually jobless, and a future in which millions of Americans will have no access to paid work is now discussed in US news magazines as a real possibility. So from this, I draw the conclusion that the teleological promise of development in capitalist mode, the idea that the rising tide will lift all boats, and dislocation from previous ways of living on the land will be compensated by new and better sources of livelihood, cannot be sustained. This promise cannot be sustained. If I'm right, then I would suggest that we need to look very carefully at what is happening on the land. Who is laying claim to land, for what purposes, and what will happen to the people who can no longer live on the land as they did before, but have nowhere else to go and no viable source of livelihood. So this is just a screenshot of rural populations, and what it shows that in most of Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, the darker color, the medium color is 50%. So this is the percentage of rural people, basically. Asia and sub-Saharan Africa are still predominantly rural. People live in the rural areas. 50% for China, 44% for Indonesia, a bit more in some places. Basically, half the world's population is still rural, and my suggestion is that they're going to continue to be. This is from Southeast Asia, the region in which I'm something of a specialist. What it shows, probably too much data there, but what it shows really briefly is that although one could say that the percentage of rural population has been declining in these 20 years from 1990 to 2010, as you would expect from agrarian transition theory, right? That the percentage of rural people would decline. However, the absolute number has increased. So even in Southeast Asia, 30 million more people are trying to live on the land in 2010 than they were in 1990. So even as the other aspects of transition are in place, that's to say, a higher percentage of GDP is moving away from agriculture towards other sectors, the people basically are still there, and my suggestion is that they're going to continue to be there. So what's been happening on the land? In Southeast Asia in the past 3 decades, since 1980, vast areas have been taken out of the current or future orbit of farmers by a few different processes. First of all, the tightening of forest boundaries, often for conservation, by plantations on a large scale, notably around 15 million hectares of oil palm in Indonesia and Malaysia, also rubber and timber in Laos and Cambodia, for example. Post-agrarian land uses, special economic zones, roads, settlement schemes, hydro schemes, etc., have also taken up huge areas of land. And more efficient and productive smallholdings that squeeze out the smaller and less efficient ones have also been taking place in these areas. So what you could say is that as 30 million more people in Southeast Asia have tried to live in the land, that the nooks and crannies and the spaces, including the informal tenure arrangements by which they were previously able to do this, have hardened across the region in the same period, giving them very much less room for maneuver than they had in the past. I'd like to give just a brief sense of this at 2 scales. So one is at the national scale. I'm just using the example of Cambodia. This is a map from around 2010. And what it shows with these crisscrosses is that everyone has taken a share of this small country. So these are zones for special economic zones, economic land concessions, oil and gas, transmission lines, hydro areas, protected areas, and so on. So this is one might say a sparsely populated country, but one in which has become very busy with a lot of different actors laying claim to land for a whole different set of purposes, while the people who were previously living on this land are finding themselves increasingly squeezed. Even in a country then which one might say has a relatively low population density, you can still end up squeezed out by these processes. Cambodia is perhaps an extreme example because of the compression of many sources of change into a short period of time and a relatively small space, but elements of these processes are found right across the Southeast Asian region. So I want to give a second example from Indonesia, which is actually my main field of research, to show you a little bit what this looks like. So one of the main processes in Southeast Asia has been the expansion of plantations. And this is a map of a sub-district in West Kalimantan, part of Borneo, which shows that all around about 1990, the entire land area was blocked out by plantations. And the white spaces along the river there are what we call the enclaves. Those are the residual spaces in which people can live after all the land is taken by the palm. So that's an enclave. This is people literally squeezed into a tiny little spot along the river, and the entire hill behind them has been taken up by plantation. This is a plantation in which the trees palms have been injected with a herbicide to kill them slowly, while new palms are planted underneath. So this is the land use change which is anticipated and expected to be permanent. One generation of palms will be replaced by another. As these palms age, new ones will come in as well. So you can see I put people in that picture just so you could see how huge the palms are. Okay, this is to show you a question of visioning. This is someone's vision of a productive landscape, one in which everything is lined up in rows, and it has a certain kind of aesthetic quality if you like regular landscapes, but there's something really very serious going on here. This is a graph prepared by a colleague, Rob Cram, which shows one reason why these very large-scale land uses are taking place, and that has to do with the returns to different sets of actors. So what he showed was that under a smallholder system, most of the returns, surprise, surprise, go to local people. Under joint venture schemes, local people, investors, and the government, everyone gets a little bit of a share. And then when big companies have a lease of state land, most of it goes to the investor, and a significant portion, much more than here, still goes to the government. And that's just the legal side, like lease fees and taxes and so on, not the entire economy of payoffs, which is also part of every large land scheme. This is to show how global are these aspirations. So this comes from the World Bank's report on agriculture expansion. Land expectation values for perennial crops. So this is another kind of visioning in which kinds of land are being viewed specifically in terms of their expected US dollar cash value per hectare. So oil palm in Indonesia is expected to yield $4,800 per annum. Production forestry has these kinds of amounts. Sugar is expected to yield $8,000 per hectare if it's in Brazil, $9,000 if it's in Kenya, $11,000 if it's in Mozambique, $18,000 if it's in Zambia, etc. So this is a way of visioning the earth in terms of the specific dollar value of what the land can produce. This is another part from this World Bank report which shows the huge reduction. 5 crops are mainly the ones that this bank report is very interested in. So maize, soy, wheat, sugarcane, and oil palm. Just 5 crops were the optic through which they viewed the world's surface in terms of thinking about what should go where should the most profits be made. And you can imagine all of the other kinds of crops which are therefore really occluded from this analysis. All the other things that people grow kind of are lost in this way of visioning the earth. This shows the dark colors, especially the red here, shows a hotspot. So maximum potential value of output for Africa, US dollars per hectare. The darker the color, the hotter the gains. So this is the area which is now viewed as the most kind of fertile zone for investment, the place where the really big profits are to be made. This is a view of tractors in the Cerrado in Brazil, but it came in an article from The Economist which says, the miracle of the Cerrado, Brazil has revolutionized its own farms. Can it do the same for others? And the target was, again, specifically Africa. Like, could you take the surface of other continents and transform them into diagrams like this, which are understood to be massively productive? Okay, so what are the implications from this? I would like to argue that any decision about land use in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, which has been my main focus here, must start with an assumption that rural population is present, and even when the number stabilizes, will continue to be present, because there are few urban or manufacturing jobs for these people. That picture I showed of the enclave, those people just perched on the edge of the river in that tiny little piece of land. The big surprise to us when we did our surveys there, this is the site of my current research on oil palm plantations, is that the young people were still there. They have not gone anywhere. There's actually nowhere for them to go, nothing else for them to do. We'd expected to find, given the extreme squeeze on land and given the fact that the plantations were only employing about 10% of the population, the working age population, 90% could not find work on the plantations which now surround them, we thought the young people would have gone. And yet they were still there. We've been checking back. We've been in this research site for 7 years now, and they're still there. So this idea that young people will simply exit from the rural scene because they will find somewhere else to go, something else to do, really is a suggestion which needs to be challenged. Therefore, rural people's needs, desires, capacities, and futures, so we're talking about 3 billion people, right, the rural part of the global population, need to be at the center of future scenarios for what happens on the land. Many of these people will be educated, at least to secondary level, and unemployed. They cannot farm as their parents did. Land availability is severely squeezed, as it has been for centuries in some cases, or more recently in others, such as Southeast Asia, where I would suggest the land boundaries are really only battened down in the last couple of decades, but they're hard now. Therefore, it's imperative, urgent, I would say, to let go of transition thinking. The thinking which suggests that we do not need to worry about all these people because they will find somewhere else to go and something else to do. But remember the graphs, especially capital, investors, national planners, are interested in productivity, not specifically in jobs, not jobs for rural people. And large-scale land uses do not produce jobs in anything like the numbers that are needed. So the final point, in terms of the conference title, about visions, whose visions, I've given some sort of graphic examples of some people's visions about how the world should be reorganized in terms of dollar value per hectare and productivity. Policymakers, decision makers, the government, working as I do at the kind of front line of the oil palm plantation, I would have to say that every time I hear language like stakeholders or planning or visioning, I would have to say I become extremely skeptical. These land frontiers in which I work are places of predatory elites, capital and local officials combined. They're really not zones in which any amount of data, visioning data, land use planning, scenario building, etc., are going to have much headway. I think this was understood. This is well understood in this group. Our opening speaker mentioned this, what he called, I love the image of the tipping point. This big boulder about to kind of, this is a real thing. And, for me, attending a meeting like this, not quite my usual venue, that's the question I really have on my mind. What are the potentials, but also the limits of perfecting data and understanding very well what's going to happen when the political forces that would actually be required to change direction are extremely hard to find, at least anywhere that I work. Thank you.
Thank you, Tania. Several questions for you. I'll try to read out a few of them. First one from Liz Law. What are your perspectives in regards to the mass and perhaps rushed rollout of community forest management in Indonesia? What are the risks?
Okay, so I have been following this, and I would say that on paper it's mass, but in practice it's really very small. because community forest management, as it's been piloted by development agencies and NGOs and so on, is a highly labor-intensive thing. To actually make forests pay as forests, with the emphasis on non-timber forest products, etc., is usually a very small-scale thing, right? And so, reading the current program for the expansion of community forestry suggests that if only enough hooking up with large-scale markets and commodity chains, etc., somehow rattan extraction can provide the solution to poverty for 50 million forest dwellers. Like, to me, it's a big rollout that actually is not going to roll out, is not going to happen, and it cannot solve the problem. Basically, because any version of community forestry prevents people from doing the two things which are lucrative: cutting timber or farming. And if those two things are off limits, all of the remainder cannot produce a viable livelihood.
Okay. One more question from Graziano Sedia. Are you aware of cases in which capital's claims on land have been successfully restrained? And if so, what can we learn from it?
Okay, so I can only speak from the things that I know well. I'll just speak from the plantation zone, since that's my current research. So there has been a 20-year campaign against the expansion of the palm plantations, which one would have to say has been, on the whole, fantastically unsuccessful. Millions and millions more hectares have been planted, and even more millions of hectares are already held by corporations in so-called land banks. So there has been opposition throughout, but has it actually stopped the train? You'd have to say no. There may be some local cases where people have managed to hold on to their land, but they're few. And there's so many cases in which opposition started out and was very successfully subverted by these what are called crony cabals, which involve investors, government officials, often local customary leaders. Basically, if you're dealing with a high-value crop like oil palm, everyone wants a share of the loot. And so the forces are extremely strong and difficult to hold back.
Okay, thank you very much, Tania.